At 9:17 a.m. on June 14, 1942, the Pacific sun hammered down on a rough forward airstrip carved from coral and packed dirt. Heat rippled across the ground as a lone P-51 Mustang rolled to a stop, its engine coughing out one last burst of exhaust before settling into a low, uneven rumble. Painted beneath its checkerboard nose was a name every crewman on the strip knew well: Bad Angel. But no one was looking at the name. 4 American airmen approached the Mustang, forming a half circle around its chewed-up left side. A massive tear metal, peeled back like the lid of a ripped can, gaped just behind the engine cowling. Scorch marks clawed across the fuselage, evidence of something that had come shockingly close to killing the pilot. Speaking of him, he was still in the cockpit, leaning one arm over the canopy rail, staring down at the crew below with a quiet, unreadable expression. What froze everyone wasn't the damage. It was the kill markings painted beneath the cockpit. One Japanese rising sun emblem and one American flag. Clean lines, fresh paint, no smudge or mistake. A deliberate tally. A sergeant whispered, "That can't be real." Another stepped closer, eyes narrowed. "Tell me that's a prank. Nobody shoots down one of ours. Nobody." He wasn't wrong. In 1942, with the Pacific War at full boil, friendly fire in the air was every pilot's nightmare. The U.S. Army Air Forces drilled one rule into their aviators harder than any other: confirm your target. Confirm your IFF. Never fire on a friendly aircraft. Violating that wasn't just a bad call, it was a career-ending, court-martial level catastrophe. And yet the painted flag remained. Quiet. Accusing. Impossible. What the ground crew didn't know, what no one here on this sun-blasted strip knew, was that, earlier that morning, 12 Americans were trapped on a jungle-covered island, barely 30 miles away. Their radio was failing. Japanese patrols were closing in. 2 rescue attempts had already been driven off by Zero fighters sweeping the skies like hawks. And somewhere out there, in the chaos of that hunt, this single P-51 had made a decision no manual, no doctrine, no sane officer would ever approve, an act so shocking that Japanese pilots who witnessed it truly believed the Americans had turned on each other. They had no idea that decision was the only reason 12 men were still alive. The sun had barely climbed above the horizon when the first reports crackled through the operations tent, describing rising plumes of smoke drifting above the small island where 12 Americans were still hiding. And every officer on the strip knew those columns meant Japanese patrols were tightening their perimeter with the ruthless precision they had perfected since the invasion of the Philippines. Intelligence officers spread maps across a makeshift table, pointing at narrow coastal ridges where Zero fighters had been spotted circling in overlapping loops that made any rescue attempt feel less like a mission and more like a slow-motion death sentence. Each new transmission arriving from the surviving radio man on the island carried a voice strained with exhaustion and fear, describing Japanese foot patrols moving inland through thick underbrush, checking ravines, and sweeping toward the only position where the stranded men could possibly remain concealed without exposing themselves to the enemy or the sun. The men on the airstrip understood that Japanese search teams rarely abandoned a pursuit, especially in 1942, when their early war confidence was still absolute, and their infantry believed that eliminating a cornered group of Americans was simply another step toward tightening Japan's grip on the Pacific. The rescue crews, meanwhile, walked between rows of battered aircraft, running hands across wing roots and fuel tanks, while quietly admitting to themselves that another failed attempt would not only risk more lives, but also alert the Japanese to the survivors' exact location, effectively sealing their fate before headquarters even approved a second attempt. The previous rescue flight, a small liaison aircraft overloaded with emergency supplies, had tried to descend through a break in the clouds, only to be intercepted by 2 Zero fighters that dove with terrifying precision and forced it to break away before it ever reached the shoreline of the island. Pilots and mechanics stood in clusters along the edge of the airstrip, watching the distant sea for any sign of returning patrols, and the tension in their voices revealed how deeply they understood the situation. Every additional minute, the survivors remained stranded, increased the likelihood that they would be discovered, surrounded, and eliminated long before a rescue plane could arrive to pull them out. Even experienced officers had trouble masking their concern, because the Pacific Theater in 1942 was not a place where luck favored isolated groups of Americans, and every man present had already witnessed too many missions end with nothing but wreckage drifting in the surf. Yet, despite the grim reality settling across the airfield, there remained a thin, stubborn thread of determination, born from the knowledge that a handful of aviators had already risked their own lives trying to break through the Japanese perimeter and reach the trapped men, and no one wanted to accept that the ocean between them and the island might soon become the only grave marker those 12 soldiers would ever have. Men glanced repeatedly at the horizon, searching for any sign of returning enemy fighters, while silently praying for a miracle that could shift the odds before the next Japanese sweep closed the last gap in the sky. Deep down, every pilot on the line knew that unless something completely unexpected disrupted the Japanese patrol pattern, the stranded Americans had only hours left before the trap snapped shut around them. And at the far end of the strip, beside the battered P-51 with the impossible kill markings, the man who had just performed that shocking act quietly tightened his straps, checked his instruments, and prepared to do something no manual in the U.S. Army Air Forces had ever imagined, because he understood that the only way to save 12 lives was to challenge the enemy's expectations in the most dangerous way possible. The tension around the airstrip thickened as the morning wore on, because every new radio update hinted that the Japanese search teams were tightening their net with practiced efficiency, moving along the ridgelines and riverbeds exactly as American intelligence officers had predicted during countless briefings about Imperial Army jungle tactics. Mechanics hurried between aircraft with toolboxes clattering against their legs, speaking in clipped exchanges that betrayed their growing anxiety, while several junior officers hovered near the operations tent, waiting desperately for any indication that the enemy patrol pattern might shift even slightly. Inside the tent, the surviving radio man's transmissions were becoming shorter and more strained, carrying bursts of static that made the listener lean closer to the handset, as if proximity alone could will the fading signal into clarity. He described the sound of movement in the trees, the unmistakable crunch of boots on dry branches, and the occasional metallic click, suggesting that Japanese soldiers were checking their rifles as they advanced through the brush. Every man present understood that once the enemy pinpointed the survivors' exact position, the fight would end in minutes, because isolated Americans in 1942 rarely survived direct confrontation against seasoned Japanese patrols. Over at the flight line, pilots huddled beside the wings of their Mustangs and Warhawks, reviewing maps with fingers tracing potential approach paths that had already proven suicidal, yet no one could bring themselves to say aloud that a third attempt might end with another aircraft burning in the surf. The collective weight of responsibility pressed down on them harder than the heat, because they all knew the rules of early Pacific Air War. Rescue attempts were noble, but losing additional aircraft only tightened the Japanese grip on the region and risked missions scheduled for later that same afternoon. Several of the crew chiefs argued quietly about fuel loads, cloud layers, and the odds of slipping a rescue plane through a gap in the enemy air cover, though each man's voice carried the same underlying fear that the Japanese pilots circling the island were far too experienced to miss even the slightest disruption in the sky. When a junior airman sprinted across the strip to report that another formation of Zero fighters had been spotted heading toward the island, the conversation died instantly, leaving nothing but the thrum of idling engines and the rasp of wind across metal skins, dented by previous engagements. To make matters worse, rumors spread that Japanese forces had expanded their shoreline perimeter, meaning the survivors now had even less space to hide, and any sudden movement toward open ground would reveal them instantly. The few officers who attempted to maintain composure found themselves biting back frustration, because every available resource on the airstrip was tied up preparing for operations elsewhere, and headquarters had not yet approved a fourth rescue attempt, especially after losing precious aircraft earlier that week. Despite this mounting pressure, the pilot of the battered P-51 remained unusually calm, sitting beneath his open canopy with his flight gloves resting on his thigh, studying the sky with a focus that made several onlookers pause and wonder what he saw that others missed. He understood that the rescue window was closing rapidly, and he also recognized that adhering strictly to doctrine meant accepting the 12 men's deaths as an inevitable consequence of the situation. As the Zero formation crossed the distant horizon in perfect combat spacing, he reached for the throttle with a quiet certainty, knowing that the only chance left required breaking every rule written in the U.S. Army Air Forces manual. With each passing second, the Japanese perimeter contracted like a tightening vice, and everyone on the airstrip sensed that the moment for conventional solutions had already slipped away, leaving only desperation and the faint hope that someone willing to defy expectations could still change the outcome. That someone, as every eye slowly turned toward the Mustang, marked with both Japanese and American kill flags, was preparing to gamble his life on a single impossible idea. Every pilot on that sun-bleached airstrip understood the regulations that governed their missions, because the U.S. Army Air Forces drilled those rules into them from the first day they touched a training aircraft, repeating them so relentlessly that they became instinct rather than memorized procedures. The most fundamental directive, printed in bold letters across multiple sections of the flight manual, stated that no aviator was ever to engage a friendly aircraft under any circumstance, even when visibility was poor, identification signals were faint, or combat stress blurred the edges of reason. Instructors warned that violating this rule not only risked catastrophic loss of life, but also undermined the trust that held a formation together, particularly in the Pacific, where the vast distances and unpredictable weather already pushed pilots to their limits. Pilots spent hours practicing identification techniques, learning silhouettes of every American airframe under every possible lighting condition, because misidentifying a target in 1942 meant sending a burst of 50 caliber rounds into an aircraft carrying men who had entrusted their lives to the same flag. Training emphasized patience above aggression, urging pilots to double-check markings, verify radio codes, and cross-reference behavior patterns before ever touching the trigger, a process designed to prevent tragedies that could fracture morale or cripple squadron integrity. No one questioned the rule, because friendly fire incidents in the early months of the Pacific War had shown precisely how swiftly confusion could spread when pilots let fear outrun discipline. The doctrine went deeper than identification. It extended into the strategic mindset the Army Air Forces wanted their aviators to uphold, insisting that cohesion and controlled action were more valuable than individual heroics. Manuals warned repeatedly that any pilot who broke formation without authorization risked leaving his wingman exposed, opening a gap the enemy could exploit with devastating consequences, especially when the opponent was flying. Zero fighters known for diving unpredictably and attacking from blind angles. Briefing officers hammered home the belief that no situation justified abandoning procedure, because even a desperate rescue attempt could not outweigh the cost of losing additional aircraft or compromising ongoing operations across the theater. Rescue guidelines were equally rigid, shaped by bitter lessons learned after multiple pilots had died trying to perform solo retrievals in hostile airspace, believing they could slip beneath the enemy's vision through sheer skill or luck. The manual stressed that rescue missions required coordinated timing, escort cover, and clear communication channels, since lone aircraft approaching contested zones were easy prey for Japanese fighters patrolling with fuel-efficient persistence. These strictures were meant to protect both rescuers and survivors, ensuring that bravery did not become recklessness and that emotion did not overshadow tactical prudence during moments of crisis. Yet despite the clarity of these rules, every man on the airstrip sensed a widening gap between doctrine and reality, because the survivors on the island had no time left for coordination, and their fraying radio made synchronized planning nearly impossible. Officers argued that a third or fourth attempt without proper preparation would violate every principle laid out in the manuals, but those standing closer to the front line understood that waiting for perfect conditions would doom the 12 Americans long before command authorized a full-scale rescue operation. The doctrine that once felt like a lifeline now seemed like a chain binding their hands, because the Japanese forces tightening around the island were not slowing, hesitating, or making mistakes. Amid all the tension and doctrinal rigidity, the pilot of the battered P-51 remained motionless beside his aircraft, listening to the overlapping arguments about risk, procedure, and protocol. He knew those rules as well as anyone. He had recited them, memorized them, and lived by them through every mission he had flown. But as he studied the horizon where the Zeros had disappeared moments earlier, he also understood a truth the manuals never admitted. Sometimes survival demanded actions that contradicted everything a pilot had ever been taught, and in that realization, he felt the first sharp edge of the impossible decision forming in his mind, a decision that would soon redefine the meaning of breaking the rules. The true scale of the crisis became undeniable once the morning reconnaissance reports arrived, revealing that the Japanese patrol routes around the island had tightened into overlapping loops designed to trap anything daring enough to enter their airspace. leaving rescue planners with a bleak map full of red arrows converging toward the last known position of the stranded Americans. Officers studying the map realized the Japanese were no longer conducting simple search patterns. They were executing a coordinated squeeze that mirrored tactics used during earlier campaigns in the Philippines, where isolated groups of U.S. soldiers had been cornered with ruthless precision. Every new message from the island confirmed this tightening pressure, as the survivors described hearing distant shouts, rustling foliage, and the deliberate cadence of men advancing through dense jungle with lethal purpose. The survivors' position had deteriorated dramatically overnight because they had been forced to abandon their original hiding place when a Japanese patrol passed dangerously close, prompting them to relocate to a narrow ravine, offering little protection and absolutely no visibility. Their only functional radio had begun failing intermittently, crackling with static whenever the radio man tried to transmit coordinates, which meant the operations tent received fragments of information that were nearly impossible to interpret under heavy atmospheric interference. Even worse, the rough terrain prevented the survivors from moving toward higher ground without exposing themselves to enemy eyes, forcing them to remain cramped in a cramped depression where heat, insects, and thirst slowly ate away at their endurance. Meanwhile, every aircraft capable of carrying out a rescue was grounded by the same obstacle: the Zero fighters sweeping the shoreline with well-practiced discipline, flying slow, fuel-efficient circuits that made stealth approaches virtually impossible. Pilots who had flown earlier sorties knew the Zero could loiter far longer than most American aircraft, allowing Japanese patrols to maintain a constant presence that resupply teams had no chance of slipping past without being spotted almost immediately. The rescue planners debated using cloud cover to shield an approach, but the scattered cumulus formations over the island offered too little concealment and too much risk, especially since the Zeros had already demonstrated their ability to nose into cloud banks and ambush aircraft emerging on the other side. Logistical officers proposed sending a small boat under cover of darkness, yet even that idea collapsed once scouts reported that Japanese observation posts had been established along the beaches, complete with concealed firing positions that could easily cut down approaching vessels before they reached the shallows. Every option the Americans considered ran headfirst into a wall of Japanese preparation, as though the enemy had anticipated every possible move and built a layered trap specifically designed to prevent any rescue attempt from succeeding. The pressure in the operations tent grew heavier with each passing hour, and several officers quietly admitted to one another that the survivors might already be living on borrowed time. Despite the grim assessments, no one on the airstrip wanted to give voice to the possibility that the men on the island might not survive the day, because acknowledging that possibility would mean accepting the failure of every pilot, mechanic, and officer present. Yet the truth loomed unmistakably over every discussion. The Japanese forces were closing in with mathematical certainty, and unless something extraordinary disrupted their pattern, the 12 survivors would be discovered before another rescue attempt could even leave the ground. The silence that settled across the tent was suffocating, because everyone present understood that they were running out of ideas, time, and morale simultaneously. At the edge of the flight line, the P-51 pilot studied the same grim situation from a distance, watching the sky as though measuring the rhythm of the Japanese patrols and calculating the fleeting gaps between their circuits. He sensed the hopelessness creeping through the airstrip, yet he also recognized the sliver of opportunity hidden within that despair, a sliver so narrow that no trained officer would ever consider it viable. While others debated doctrine and probability, he focused solely on the truth unfolding before him. The Japanese trap was nearly perfect, but its perfection left one vulnerability, an opportunity so dangerous that only a pilot willing to risk everything could make use of it. The pilot of the battered P-51 had been watching the sky with an intensity that unsettled several nearby airmen, because he wasn't scanning for enemy formations like everyone else. Instead, he was studying the rhythm of the airspace itself, paying attention to subtle fluctuations in movement that most pilots overlooked when stress and exhaustion pulled their focus elsewhere. He noticed that one of the American liaison aircraft, returning from a failed rescue attempt earlier that morning, had drifted far off its expected course, flying at an unusually low altitude that didn't match the standard recovery profile taught in training manuals or reinforced during squadron briefings. At first glance, the deviation looked like pilot error, yet something about the aircraft's sluggish climb and irregular banking pattern suggested that its crew had been attempting to signal something from the edge of the Japanese perimeter. As he replayed the aircraft's path in his mind, the P-51 pilot recognized that the liaison plane had deliberately dipped its wings twice, an old field-expedient distress signal, rarely used in formal operations, but sometimes employed by downed crews to indicate a nearby threat they couldn't transmit clearly over radio. The maneuver had been subtle enough to escape the attention of most observers on the ground, especially with the airstrip buzzing with tension and noise, but the Mustang pilot had spent enough time flying escort missions to understand the desperate shorthand used by crews trapped in hostile territory. He realized the aircraft had been warning anyone watching that the Japanese search pattern had shifted unexpectedly, creating a brief window where enemy fighters were momentarily concentrated on the wrong sector of the island. Even more telling was the faint smoke trail drifting above the distant tree line, barely visible through the haze but unmistakable to someone trained to read battlefield environments like a mechanic reads engine noise. The smoke didn't rise in a clean pillar. Instead, it wavered sideways, caught by a gust that indicated the island's inland winds were stronger than usual, a detail that could conceal movement or sound for anyone trying to approach from the leeward side. The pilot understood immediately that such atmospheric quirks mattered enormously, because a rescue plane using that wind shadow could descend lower than normal without drawing the immediate attention of Japanese lookouts or patrol aircraft. As he pieced together these clues, his attention shifted to the map spread across a crate near the operations tent, where officers had been debating rescue routes for over an hour without realizing that the earlier liaison aircraft had essentially provided the missing piece of information. By connecting the aircraft's irregular flight path with the direction of the smoke drift, he realized the survivors must have moved farther inland than originally believed, likely taking advantage of a natural depression or ravine that offered concealment but limited their ability to signal effectively. That revelation meant the Japanese forces were closing in on the wrong location, tightening their net around an area the survivors had abandoned under the cover of darkness. The pilot knew he had seconds to decide whether this pattern was coincidence or genuine intelligence, because the Japanese fighters would soon return to their broader patrol routes, erasing the brief misalignment that might allow someone to exploit their temporary confusion. He also recognized that waiting for official approval would guarantee failure, since the senior officers were still arguing over the risks, unwilling to consider any plan that didn't align with established procedure. The truth was brutally simple. Only someone in a fast, maneuverable aircraft could confirm whether the survivors had actually shifted positions, and only a pilot willing to defy regulations could act on that information before the window closed forever. He tightened his grip on the cockpit rail, feeling the warmth of the metal beneath his hand, and understood that he was standing at the edge of a moment that would define not only the fate of the 12 stranded Americans, but also his own legacy as an aviator. Every instinct drilled into him demanded caution and adherence to doctrine, yet the quiet clarity of the battlefield told him that hesitation would doom the men still clinging to life on that island. With a slow breath, he made his choice, knowing that the path ahead would lead him far outside the boundaries of anything the manuals had ever prepared him for. The realization settled over him with an almost physical weight, because once he understood the significance of the survivors' improvised signal, he also recognized that no conventional rescue strategy could exploit it before the Japanese patrols corrected their formation and sealed the sky again with suffocating precision. He knew the clock was already bleeding away precious seconds, and every instinct shaped by years of flight discipline warned him that acting alone would not only violate protocol, but also place him squarely in the path of enemy fighters, hunting anything that moved. Yet beneath the fear, another awareness took root, sharper and far more dangerous. The chaos created by the shifting Japanese patrols offered a fleeting loophole, but taking advantage of it required a move utterly outside the boundaries of doctrine. He replayed the earlier moment, when the liaison aircraft had tried to warn the airstrip with its off-course maneuvering, and the image struck him like a blow, because the plane's strange descent had inadvertently created a false implication that something catastrophic had occurred near the shoreline. The Japanese fighters had reacted instantly, pivoting toward the area as if expecting debris, survivors, or some sign of a downed American crew. That reaction revealed something rare and invaluable. The enemy would chase any signal suggesting a vulnerable target, especially one resembling a damaged or disoriented aircraft struggling to escape their tightening net. The more he considered it, the clearer the shape of his dangerous idea became: forming in his mind with the cold logic of someone who understood exactly how predator and prey behaved in contested skies. He realized that if he could generate a convincing false signal, one dramatic enough to pull the Japanese away from the real survivor position, he might create the narrow corridor needed for a rescue plane to slip through unnoticed. But generating that signal required something far more extreme than a simple diversionary pass or a feigned radio malfunction. It demanded a flashpoint so unmistakable that the Japanese would abandon their pattern instantly and converge on the wrong location with absolute confidence. There was only one event that always triggered such a reaction among enemy pilots: the sight or sound of an American aircraft being shot down, especially if the fall appeared sudden and chaotic enough to resemble a pilot losing control under duress. The thought chilled him, because it meant intentionally replicating that exact event, and he understood instantly why no officer would ever authorize such a maneuver. He would need to target a friendly aircraft briefly, precisely, and in a way that created the unmistakable signature of a fatal hit, while somehow ensuring that the crew survived the strike and could ditch safely without provoking catastrophic injury or permanent damage. It was a strategy so reckless that most pilots would have dismissed it before the idea fully formed, yet he recognized that only such a shocking act could create the panic and misdirection necessary to lure Japanese fighters to the wrong place. He weighed the morality in a single, painful moment, knowing that firing on a friendly plane contradicted everything he had ever been taught, from the strict identification drills hammered into him during basic training, to the silent trust baked into every formation he had flown with his squadron. But he also understood the brutal truth of the battlefield unfolding around him. If he didn't act, the 12 Americans hiding in that ravine would be found, surrounded, and eliminated long before the sun reached its peak. Their radio was failing, their water was running out, and their position was collapsing with each passing minute, and waiting for command approval was nothing short of a death sentence. He exhaled slowly, feeling the decision crystallize inside him like steel, and he accepted the consequences even before the plan fully formed. He would have to approach a friendly aircraft, fire a controlled burst at a non-critical section, and create the unmistakable visual signature of a shoot-down, all while ensuring the crew could bail out or ditch safely in waters far from the Japanese perimeter. It was a gamble that could destroy his career, his aircraft, and his reputation, yet he felt a strange calm settle over him as he embraced the plan, because he knew with absolute certainty that no one else on that airstrip was willing, or perhaps able, to make the choice that destiny now placed squarely in his hands. He pushed the throttle forward with slow, deliberate pressure, feeling the Mustang surge down the strip as the engine roared with a harsh metallic growl that vibrated through his ribs while the early light glinted across the aircraft's scarred fuselage. As the wheels lifted from the ground, he banked sharply toward the coastline, positioning himself between the rescue zone and the broader Japanese patrol pattern, knowing he had only minutes before the enemy fighters returned to their rigid formation and sealed off every approach corridor once more. Below him, the ocean shimmered with deceptive calm, masking the violence unfolding on the island, where 12 Americans were trying to remain silent despite the jungle closing in on them like a tightening snare. He scanned the horizon for the returning liaison aircraft he intended to engage, spotting it limping homeward with a damaged wingtip and trailing smoke that made the plane appear more wounded than it truly was, a detail that both helped and complicated his plan. The crew aboard that aircraft had no idea what he was about to attempt, yet he trusted their training and their instincts, believing they would recognize his intention the moment he positioned himself off their wing and dipped his nose twice. The silent signal every combat pilot understood as a warning to brace for an emergency maneuver. His heart hammered as the aircraft responded, wobbling slightly as if the crew had realized something unprecedented was about to unfold. He rolled the Mustang onto its side and slid into formation beside the damaged aircraft, maintaining just enough distance to avoid startling the pilot, while carefully aligning his gun sight with a thin strip of outer fuselage that would cause structural distress without compromising the aircraft's ability to ditch safely. The space felt unbearably small, each breath thick with the weight of what he was about to do, and he reminded himself that hesitation would only reduce the survivors' chances and increase the risk to the friendly crew whose lives he hoped to protect. Once the line was perfect, he squeezed the trigger for a fraction of a second, releasing a tight burst of .50 caliber fire that ripped across the liaison aircraft's skin with a sharp metallic scream echoing through the sky. The effect was immediate and dramatic, the damaged aircraft lurching violently as pieces of aluminum spiraled away in glittering arcs that caught the sunlight like falling shards of glass, creating exactly the kind of explosive visual signature Japanese pilots instinctively recognized as a kill in progress. At that precise moment, 3-0 fighters emerged from a cloud bank to the east, their formation tightening as they dove toward what they believed was a vulnerable American aircraft attempting to escape after suffering a catastrophic hit. The Mustang pilot watched their descent with grim satisfaction, knowing the bait had been taken with ruthless predictability, because Japanese doctrine demanded aggressive pursuit whenever an enemy appeared fatally compromised. He pulled away hard, climbing to a higher altitude to avoid drawing attention to himself, while the damaged aircraft descended toward the ocean in a controlled glide that mirrored the desperate movements of a genuine shoot-down victim struggling to survive. The Zeros closed rapidly, spiraling downward with lethal precision, fully convinced they were about to finish off a crippled American crew and claim another victory for the Empire. The pilot of the Mustang felt a surge of relief, tinged with guilt, as he watched the Japanese fighters chase the decoy far from the island, leaving behind a gap in the patrol pattern wide enough for a rescue plane to slip through without triggering alarms or attracting enemy eyes. Below him, the liaison aircraft executed the ditching maneuver with remarkable skill, hitting the water in a controlled skid that sent spray erupting into the air, convincing the Japanese even further that they had successfully forced a doomed aircraft into the sea. The Mustang banked away toward the island, heart pounding with adrenaline, knowing he had achieved the first step of his impossible plan. The Japanese fighters, consumed by the apparent victory, never once looked toward the ravine where 12 Americans clung to life, unaware that fate had shifted because one pilot dared to do the unthinkable in the span of a single breathtaking minute. The brilliance of the maneuver only became fully clear once the Mustang pilot leveled out above the coastline and studied the shifting geometry of the Japanese response. Because the enemy fighters had reacted exactly as he anticipated, abandoning their previous patrol routes in favor of a concentrated dive toward the decoy aircraft that appeared mortally wounded. Japanese doctrine in 1942 heavily emphasized decisive action, pushing pilots to finish crippled enemies immediately to prevent potential recovery or counterattack, which meant any aircraft displaying erratic movement or trailing smoke became an irresistible target. By forcing the liaison plane to simulate a catastrophic hit at the precise moment the Japanese fighters regained visual contact, he had triggered an automatic behavioral response designed into their training long before the war reached the Pacific. The effectiveness of the deception relied not merely on the gunfire, but on the specific physics of the ditching maneuver, because an aircraft gliding toward the water with a damaged fuselage created a signature drastically different from a pilot attempting to fake distress through artificial aerobatic irregularities. The nose-down glide angle, the shudder of disrupted airflow across torn metal, and the expanding spray upon impact were all visual cues Japanese aviators had been taught to interpret as the final moments of a successful intercept. Every detail reinforced the illusion, leaving no room for suspicion, especially when the decoy aircraft's trajectory aligned perfectly with the shadowed region of the sea, where earlier reports had suggested American survivors might be attempting to signal for rescue. What made the gambit even more effective was the way it disrupted the momentum of Japanese patrol coordination, because the sudden chase forced 3 fighters to break formation and abandon their prescribed circuit, pulling them into a tight pursuit vector that inadvertently created a hole in the defensive perimeter large enough to slip an entire squadron through. Japanese patrol doctrine depended on overlapping coverage designed to eliminate blind spots, but the split-second pivot toward the apparent kill site caused a cascade effect, pulling nearby aircraft slightly out of position as they attempted to maintain visual contact with their comrades. In that brief moment, the sky above the island shifted from a perfectly sealed trap into a fractured pattern with gaps wide enough for a skilled pilot to exploit. The Mustang pilot worked through these calculations instinctively, analyzing the swirl of contrails and the spacing between enemy fighters with the same precision other men used to read instrumentation panels. He understood that the Japanese fighters, now locked into the pursuit, would remain fixated until they either confirmed the crash or executed a secondary pass to eliminate any survivors attempting to swim clear of the wreckage. That predictable fixation created a window of approximately 8 to 11 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat terms, during which the enemy's attention would remain directed away from the island where the 12 Americans clung to life. The entire success of the rescue now depended on exploiting that narrow temporal fracture before the enemy regained its rhythm and sealed the airspace once more. He also recognized that the ocean's reflective surface would confuse the Japanese pilots further, because sunlight bouncing off the waves created shimmering distortions that made it difficult to distinguish debris from movement, forcing them to spend valuable time circling the ditching site in search of a hypothetical crew attempting to escape. This distraction magnified the effectiveness of the decoy, drawing the fighters deeper into the wrong quadrant, while simultaneously masking any American aircraft attempting to approach the island from the opposite direction under lower altitude and reduced engine profile. The Mustang pilot banked slightly, watching the Japanese fighters spiral toward the false crash zone like hawks diving on wounded prey, fully aware that this precise pattern had been the missing key in every failed rescue attempt earlier that morning. His maneuver had weaponized the enemy's strength against them, transforming their aggressive pursuit doctrine into a vulnerability that created exactly the opportunity the stranded Americans needed. And as he swung his aircraft back toward the island, maintaining a low altitude to avoid detection, he felt the first surge of cautious hope, pushing back against the grim certainty that had dominated the airstrip only hours earlier. The deception had worked flawlessly, and the door to the rescue was now open, narrow, fragile, and fleeting, but open nonetheless. All that remained was ensuring someone reached the men before the Japanese realized they had been lured into chasing a ghost. The rescue plane launched the moment the Mustang pilot transmitted the brief coded confirmation that the Japanese fighters had taken the bait, because every second gained from the deception increased the fragile possibility that the stranded Americans could be reached before the enemy realized the crash site was nothing more than an elaborate illusion. The small liaison aircraft skimmed just above the waterline, its engine throttled back to reduce noise, while the pilot hugged the coastline with the precision of someone who understood that a single misjudged turn could push him into the open sky, where drifting Japanese patrols might still lurk. Salt spray streaked across the windshield as the aircraft navigated the narrow corridor created by the Mustang's daring gambit, climbing only when rising terrain made low-level flight impossible. As the rescue plane approached the island's leeward side, the pilot spotted patches of disturbed foliage that matched the pattern described by the survivors during their last coherent transmission, providing the first concrete confirmation that the men had indeed moved inland to evade the Japanese patrols. He banked sharply, scanning the ravine for any sign of movement, and after several agonizing passes, he finally saw a small cluster of makeshift markers, broken branches arranged in a deliberate triangular shape, indicating the survivors were alive and waiting for extraction. The sight sent a jolt of relief through the aircraft, because it meant the men had held out long enough for the rescue mission to reach them, despite dehydration, exhaustion, and the approaching danger that had shadowed them throughout the night. The landing zone, however, presented a dangerous challenge, because the ravine's uneven terrain and dense vegetation left no clear space for a conventional landing, forcing the pilot to execute a risky short-field touchdown on a narrow strip of compacted sand near the mouth of a freshwater stream. He descended with meticulous control, guiding the aircraft between jagged rocks and leaning trees until the wheels finally met the ground, with a jarring skid that sent dust curling upward in thick, swirling clouds. For several long seconds, he kept the engine at a low idle, scanning the tree line for movement, while his heart hammered with the knowledge that Japanese patrols could appear at any moment if the deception collapsed sooner than expected. The survivors emerged suddenly from the shadows, staggering toward the aircraft with a mix of disbelief and urgency etched into their dirt-covered faces, each man carrying only what equipment he could salvage before abandoning their previous hiding spot. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat, their boots torn from the unforgiving terrain, and their eyes wide with the strained alertness of men who had been too close to death for far too long. The radio man, still clutching the battered handset that had kept their hope alive, paused only long enough to scan the skies before urging the others forward in a hoarse whisper that conveyed both desperation and gratitude. The rescue crew pulled them aboard with brisk, practiced motions, helping the weakest climb into the small cabin, while urging the others to press tighter against one another to make room. The cramped space grew stifling almost immediately, filled with the mingled scent of sweat, seawater, and adrenaline as the pilot advanced the throttle and coaxed the overloaded aircraft toward takeoff speed. The engine strained under the weight of 13 men crowded into a frame designed for far fewer, and for a terrifying moment the wheels bumped unevenly along the rough ground without gaining lift, creating a sickening fear that the aircraft might stall before clearing the ridge ahead. At the final possible moment, the aircraft surged upward, barely skimming the treetops as it clawed into the air, gaining altitude with the reluctant determination of a machine pushed well beyond its intended limits. Below them, the ravine receded into a patchwork of shadows and sunlight, swallowing the footprints and broken branches that marked the survivors' last stand. As the rescue plane banked toward the open ocean, none of the men dared to speak, each fully aware that the Japanese fighters could reappear at any moment if they broke off their pursuit of the decoy and realized the trap had been sprung. But the sky ahead remained clear, and as the aircraft settled into a low, steady flight path back toward the American airstrip, the men finally allowed themselves a moment of fragile relief, understanding that their survival had hinged entirely on one Mustang pilot who had risked everything, his aircraft, his reputation, and his future, to create the single impossible window that made their rescue possible. The airstrip fell into an uneasy hush when the P-51 finally reappeared on the horizon, descending with a heavy, uneven glide that immediately signaled something was wrong, because no Mustang flew like that unless its pilot had pushed the aircraft far beyond its intended limits. Mechanics dropped their tools and shaded their eyes, watching the damaged warbird limp across the sky while its propeller stuttered in short, ragged bursts that hinted at internal strain inflicted during the earlier decoy maneuver. As the wheels met the ground with a rough, jarring bounce, dust whipped across the runway, and every man nearby instinctively stepped forward, drawn by a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and confusion. The aircraft rolled to an unsteady stop near the same coral patch where it had departed earlier, and the pilot remained motionless for several seconds, gripping the cockpit frame as though steadying himself after a plunge through chaos. When he finally opened the canopy, sunlight spilled across his sweat-streaked face, revealing the exhaustion etched into every line around his eyes. Yet, there was also a quiet steadiness there, an unspoken recognition that he had accomplished something extraordinary, even if no one else yet understood how or why. As he climbed down, several ground crew moved toward him cautiously, unsure whether they were greeting a returning hero or confronting a man who had just broken the most sacred rule in the U.S. Army Air Forces. The mechanics bent immediately toward the Mustang's wounded fuselage, tracing the fresh bullet holes with fingers that trembled slightly at the thought of how close the pilot had come to losing control. Jagged metal curled outward from the punctures, and streaks of heat-baked discoloration radiated across the skin like scars earned in a knife fight, confirming that the aircraft had endured more fire than any of them had anticipated. One crewman crouched lower and spotted a second American flag painted beneath the canopy, brushed hastily but unmistakably deliberate, marking the friendly aircraft the pilot had damaged to create the deception that made the rescue possible. Whispers rippled across the flight line as more men gathered, each trying to reconcile what they were seeing with the doctrine that had shaped their entire understanding of aerial combat. The idea that a U.S. pilot had intentionally fired on a fellow American still defied logic. Yet the survival of the 12 rescued soldiers now en route to the airstrip, with grimy faces and trembling hands, cast the act in a completely different light. Rumors spread quickly, first suggesting a navigational accident, then a misfire, and finally something far more audacious, a calculated choice that required both precision and absolute disregard for personal consequence. A senior officer finally approached the Mustang, hands clasped behind his back, studying the damage with the cold scrutiny of someone accustomed to evaluating reports rather than witnessing their aftermath firsthand. He said nothing at first, merely walking around the aircraft, examining each torn panel as though assembling a timeline from the wounds carved into the metal. When he eventually looked the pilot in the eye, the question he asked carried no anger, only stunned bewilderment. "What exactly did you do out there?" His tone carried both accusation and reluctant respect, because he already suspected the truth, even if protocol demanded a formal explanation. The pilot answered quietly, offering only the essential details, describing the deceptive strike, the controlled ditching, and the diversion that had pulled the Japanese fighters into the empty quadrant where the decoy aircraft rested beneath rising plumes of sea spray. As he spoke, the rescued men arrived at the edge of the crowd, their exhausted faces turning toward the pilot with expressions that blended gratitude, disbelief, and a kind of reverence that transcended formal rank. They knew better than anyone that without his unprecedented decision, they would now be lying in a ravine surrounded by enemy patrols,